Whoa, what's up everybody? This is Tony, and today we're going to go over real quick on how to understand the exposure triangle. Very, very common question that lingers in the photography, videography world is, how do you understand the freaking exposure triangle? It's insane, right? If you're a new photographer and you've been shooting in auto this whole entire time, but you want to elevate your game to the next level, well, you got to understand manual controls. So that way you can dictate the outcome of every photo. Hi, I'm Tony, and this is the Tony Narrative Show, where we go over tips, tricks, and tutorials, triple T for short. We can kind of do some other things if we want to, but sometimes, maybe, I don't know, a couple of vlogs here and there. So the biggest thing with the exposure triangle is understanding where to go from point A to point B to point C, right? So you have three things that typically dictate how your photo is going to be exposed or your video is going to be exposed. You got your shutter speed, you got your aperture, and you also got your ISO, which is not short for anything. It is just ISO. So don't go look it up and see what it's short for. You're going to find a whole bunch of different answers, and some answers you don't want to see, but you know what? Go look it up, right? Just do it. You're going to do it anyways. Might as well do it. Don't do it now. If you're going to do anything now, make sure you hit that like button and that subscribe button, so I can give you more value all the time. But let's get back to it. Let's talk about the exposure triangle, right? So the exposure triangle, we have shutter speed, which is going to be indicated in purple today, or aperture, which is going to be indicated in this brown color. Don't get confused, I am using orange also to notate. And ISO is going to be indicated in blue. So as you can see with the exposure triangle, shutter speed, aperture, ISO. So the slower our shutter speed, the more the shutter our shutter speed is, the more motion we get. The faster our shutter speed is, the stiller the image is going to be, right? When that comes down to photos. With video, the slower our shutter speed is, the more motion blur we can get in the action. It gives that more cinematic feel to it. If you had higher shutter speed on video, you can get more of a choppy-ish kind of feel to it. It's going to be more movement's going to be more stiff, right? Well, it's just because there's more frame rates captured in video when you're using a higher shutter speed. So these two things go hand in hand for photography and for videography, but they are different. They do capture a different feel to them. Obviously, with photos, when you're taking pictures of kids, you want to stop the motion, right? But if you're shooting video, you don't want the motion to look too stiff when you're shooting kids, right? Now, there's certain times where you want to go off of the shutter speed and go a little bit higher in video. That's breaking the 180 rule, which the 180 rule is if you're shooting at 30 frames per second, you want your shutter speed to be at 60 frames, 1/60 of a shutter speed. It's okay to break that sometimes, where if you're shooting 30 frames per second and you want to shoot at 1/125th, sometimes that's okay. Sometimes you don't have a choice. You need a little more light. You don't have a strong enough light to capture what you're doing, so you bump your shutter speed down, or if you have too much light coming, you can bump it up, right? So it's okay to break it, but there is a 180 rule, and it's been used for a long time, right? Now, aperture, the more closed off your aperture is, which by closed off, what I mean is, so this is aperture right here, all the way open. If you want to, all the way closed, sorry. If you want to open it up, you open it up. Now, that's a smaller number, right? So imagine going from 1 to 16. 1 is wide open, 16 is real close. It's confusing. It'll make sense in the future as you understand this a little bit more. But remember, the smaller number, the bigger the hole. Bigger number, the smaller the hole. Boom. Blew your mind already. We haven't even gotten into this just yet. So, more aperture, a bigger opening is going to give you more light, right? Less aperture, bigger number, smaller hole, is going to give you less light, but also affects the blurriness of the background. So right now, I'm shooting this at 1.8 on a Canon 50mm, the Nifty 50. And at one point, you can see how kind of like blown out the background is a little bit. If I was to raise the aperture up to like f-stop of 4 or 5.6, you would see more detail behind me. Which, by the way, after we move to the next section, aperture is going to be referred to f-stops, okay? Got it. That's just, if somebody says, hey, go up a stop, an f-stop, that they're talking about aperture. If they just say go up a stop, they're talking about just anything, right? The next thing we want to look at and talk about is ISO, the sensitivity of light. So ISO is the sensitivity your camera will have towards the light and the surroundings. So obviously, if we have a lower ISO number, then our light is not as sensitive as it would be if we had a higher ISO number. So look at the range of like 100 ISO to 4000 ISO. That can tell you a lot about how sensitive your camera is going to be to the light and the surroundings. So a smaller number, less sensitive; a larger number, more sensitive. But the bigger the number, the more grain you get built up in the footage, in the photo, because the camera is trying to compensate, right? So for photography at night, especially night photography, grain is okay because you're expecting to see that. Our eyes naturally kind of give us a little bit of grainy texture at night too, just as well, to boost our natural viewing exposure. In photos, it's okay just as well. Now, when it comes to video, sometimes your footage can be broken down if you have too high of an ISO number, which is why we use lights, the lighter subject, right? I have a light right here in front of me and a light off to the side. So I'm getting light coming in here. I'm also getting light coming over here too, just as well. So I can keep my ISO number lower. Got it. Let's move on to the next step. So the next step we're going to look at is going to be the compensation simulator, right? So most cameras these days come with a exposure compensation simulator, right? It's a little like, it'll show you the preview of how your exposure looks on your camera, especially mirrorless. DSLRs, if you shoot in live mode, you can see that. But mirrorless cameras, what you see on the camera is what you're gonna get back, right? Now, also, there's a little bar at the bottom of this of your screen or your viewfinder that has a couple little dashes in it, right? This is it. So we have 0 for perfectly exposed, +1 for stop over, +2 for 2 stops over, and -1 for 1 stop under. And this is supposed to be a -1. I don't know why I wrote a plus sign. -2, sorry, for 2 stops under. Now, the benefit to this being on your camera, especially if you're shooting photos, is that you can quickly adjust what you need to adjust, right? So if you're shooting pictures of kids and you know that you need to have a higher shutter speed because it's action, but right now you're at 1/160, you really should be at like minimum of 1/125. I always shoot kids at no less than 1/250. So if you're at 1/60 and you have too much light coming in, so you're +1, well, cool, you're shooting kids. Adjust that to twice as much to get 1/125, and boom, now you're back into exposed, right? So that's the cool thing about that little exposure simulator right there, little whatever you want to call it. I just call it exposure simulator because it pretty much simulates what my exposure is. It allows you to quickly make adjustments on the fly. Pay attention to that. Sometimes it's hard for us in our trained eye to see what's exposed and what's not exposed for our camera. Sometimes the camera will show you one thing, but it really doesn't look that way on the inside. So just go with your gut feeling and trust that measurement right there, right? So let's actually put this in simulation real quick, and then we'll go over some other things at the end. So the first thing we want to kind of simulate here is adjusting shutter speed. So obviously shutter speed controls how much motion we have in a photo or a video. How do we play with that? How do we adjust it, right? So here we got a demonstration. We are a stop under exposed. We want to get it perfectly 0, right? Our shutter speed is 1/125. Our f-stop aperture, like I said, is 1.8 for our f-stop. ISO is 200. We want to keep our f-stop at 1.8. So we're going to keep it at 1.8. And I really like the sensitivity of my light, so I'm going to keep it at 200, right? I need to go up a stop for exposure. It's too dark right now. So how do I get that light back without adjusting my f-stop or my ISO? Well, rule of thumb here is that all these numbers work in doubles. So if you want to add light just by adjusting the shutter speed, and you don't have too much motion going on, it's a nice still image, Well, we can drop that shutter speed down to 1/60. That will compensate to bring us from -1 to 0 and be perfectly exposed based upon our camera. Now, obviously the settings can be different for everybody, but typically, if you just divide that number in half, you'll get your light back. And that's only adjusting the shutter speed, right? So say we don't want to adjust the shutter speed. Say our shutter speed is 1/125th. We're shooting video. We're shooting it at 60 frames a second. We have to keep our shutter speed there, right? We're shooting in broad daylight, so we can't really bring our ISO up the match. So we want to adjust some other stuff, right? So here we got another demonstration. This time we're 2 stops too exposed, overexposed. We need to keep our shutter speed at 1/125th, right? We're shooting a video, we're shooting at 60 frames per second. Or we're taking pictures of kids, and we need to have a little bit of motion blur, but not too much. We need to keep it right where it's at. We can't adjust that. ISO, we're outside, it's broad daylight. We need to keep that about 200. Obviously, if it's broad daylight, I would probably be shooting at ISO 100, but this is a demo, and I drew this out, so it can be whatever I want it to be, right? Now, what we're gonna do here, we're gonna adjust the f-stop. We're 2 stops overexposed, so we need to double this to get to there. So 1.8 times 2 is 3.6 times 2 again. Well, we're probably going to be sitting at an f-stop of 5.6 to 7. And that's kind of just depending on your lens and kind of how fast it is, and just right there kind of playing with it. But an f-stop of 5.6 to f-stop of 7 should bring us back down to an even, nice, solid exposure. Now, with these higher f-stops, you're going to have less motion, less background blur. But if you're shooting kids playing, if you're shooting landscape, if you're shooting like any kind of video, for me, when I do video, it's always like f4. I typically keep that f-stop a little bit more closed off, less background blur, because I want to kind of get a little bit of my surroundings just as well. So I kind of shoot at f4 myself. But from here, if I was only 1 stop overexposed, I would just go to f4. But from right here, it's probably going to be f5.6 to f7. And that's how you adjust the aperture f-stop to compensate back. Now, we can't change shutter speed. We can't change aperture. We have to change ISO. That's just what we have to do because of our lighting situation and what we want. We're shooting, for this example, we're going to be shooting at 30 frames per second. So we need to have our shutter speed at 1/160. So that cannot change. Now, maybe we have a Canon pancake lens on there, a 24 millimeter, and its f-stop is 2.8. It can't go any lower than that, so we can't bring any more light in. So we're at f2.8 right there, right? We're stuck. So 1/60 for shutter speed, 2.8 for f-stop. But we need to get light back into the footage or the photo. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this ISO 400 and we're going to make it compensate to get us properly exposed. So we're -2 under. We're 2 stops underexposed. We need to go up 2 stops. So to go up 1 stop to -1, we're going to double 400 to 800. To hit the perfect exposure, we need to make this 1600. Boom. That's it. And now you have an exposed photo or video. I mean, it's crazy how simple this works, right? If you don't want to mess with your shutter speed, you don't want to mess with your aperture, double up you're a stop under, double your ISO. If your ISO is too high for your liking and you want to raise your shutter speed, you can double that, or go back down. Now, one last thing I want to talk about that's a little bit annoying, that kind of confuses you a little bit, is what happens if your shutter speed is 1/125. Your f-stop is, well, let's say 1.8 again. Actually, scratch that out. Let's do an f-stop of f4. And then we want to do 200 for ISO. So here we have 1/125 for shutter. We have our aperture at f4, and we have 200 ISO, right? Now, here's the situation here. We're outside, we're taking photos, beautiful day. It is freaking sunny, it's high noon. Well, a couple things are happening here. We don't want to mess with our shutter. We like the shutter speed, we're capturing the right amount of motion blur, so that's got to stay the same. We have too much sunlight coming in. ISO is 200. The lowest natively we can typically go is 100 ISO. Right? So we've already gone down to stop a light, and we're still 2 stops overexposed. So what we can do here is that we can bump our aperture up to f8. Okay, we're a little bit less exposed now, so we're still 1 stop over. We can play between f11 and f16, but the Sunny 16 rule kicks in. If you don't know what that is, take a moment to look it up real quick. But the Sunny 16 rule kicks in. We're sitting at aperture f16. That'll keep everything normal and right where we're going to keep our shutter speed at. That is a high f-stop. Right, so you're not gonna have any background blur. You're not gonna really pull the subject out of the photo, but it's sunny outside. The other way to fix this is to use ND filters. If you had an ND filter on there, you could have added 2 stops of light or 3 stops of light. You could have reduced that, right? You could have cranked that variable ND filter to adjust for F16, F8 to keep you at F4. That way, you could have, made do with this, right? If you really like 200 ISO, boom, right there. Variable ND filters, something in the future, especially for video work, to keep your shutter speed perfect, that 180 rule. You need that. You don't have to have it, but you need that. Right? But look at what I did here real quick. So I had to adjust ISO and aperture to keep my shutter speed the same, right? So I took away light, and I took away light from 2 different spots to give this the priority, right? And that goes elsewise too. So this is more common in video on this next one, because you really can only adjust 2 things out of the 3. Shooting at 30 frames a second, 1/160. We have an f-stop of, let's say 2.8. And we have ISO at 100. We have ISO 100, f-stop 2.8, 1/160. We got to keep that frame rate in that shutter speed. So that has to stay the same. We cannot change the shutter speed. Has to say that. 1/160. Now, it is too dark. We are a stop underexposed, right? So what we can do is we can try to adjust the aperture. We can't do that here. Keep that closed off. We're stop underexposed. So let's bump up ISO to 200. That will help out to get that exposure back. Now, also, if f2.8 has too much background blur for you, you know that 1/60, 2.8 aperture, 200 ISO is exposed, but you have too much background blur. You need the foreground and background to be in focus. Well, we need to deepen the depth of field. Aperture is depth of field. I covered that in one of my videos previously. So DOF, depth of field, how much is actually in focus is what aperture controls. So we're at f2.8. We want to bring this up to f4. Now, if you look at what just happened, our shutter speed stayed the same. We had initially went from f2.8, stayed the same. We bumped our ISO up to 200 ISO to get that perfect exposure. But we decided that f4 was better suited for us. We went up a whole stop. We added a whole stop of light back. We took away a stop of light. because we went up to a bigger number, less light. How do we get that back, right? So here's a situation where you're adjusting one thing, but you can't adjust the other, and it's messing up your exposure. So in order to get this light back, we need to actually bump up our ISO to 400. So technically, these two are equivalent to these two. But there's going to be a cinematic view difference, right? The photo is going to look different. This is going to have more background blur. This is going to have less of it. But as far as exposure, f2.8 and 200 and f4 and 400 in this situation are the same. That is the exposure triangle. And about, I don't know, 15 minutes maybe? Maybe it was too long. I don't know. Maybe less. I haven't really cut and edited this yet, right? But, boom! You questions, comments, concerns? Let me know in the comment section. I'm Tony. You've been awesome. This has been the Tony Narrative Show. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And if this helped you out, share it with your friends and family. If it didn't help you out, let me know. I'll fix it. But till then, peace out.